This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, any reactions to what we talked about last week? I think, Neva, when you ended, you said people needed a chance to take it in.
Yes, ma'am. Alexis came in and processed with us, and we talked about it. I'm trying to remember. It's been a long week since last week. What the thoughts were. Most of the thoughts were, Alexis helped me, that the information is really good. Occasionally it's disturbing. Help me out, group that was here last week.
Occasionally?
Courtney just watched it.
Probably all the time it's disturbing.
Yes, I think it's not shocking, but it is disturbing, and sometimes it's difficult, but it does definitely help us have some perspective on where some of our young women are coming from in their day. So that was, I think, the general reaction amongst the group.
Yeah, a lot of what was said, we've experienced in person.
Yeah.
Oh.
You know, Alexa, when I moved from Massachusetts and came to FUMPS, I learned more I was there as a direct therapist for 18 months, and then I stayed because I went to work for the Children's Advocacy Center. So I was still in the building for another 2.5 years, and I had all those kids. And I've been doing this work since 1974, and I learned more from those girls in the 18 months that I was their direct therapist than I have in all the time I've done this, just because of who they were and what they had experienced and the way they reacted to it. So it was very different than other parts. All parts of the country are different, but in Massachusetts, we had kind of grappled with this whole issue many years before, and the sexual abuse teams were set up, and there was a lot going on around that issue to protect kids. And then when I got here, none of that was in place. So it was a real learning curve. So, and I told Micah, I thought you guys did a fabulous job. I know this is not the most fun training. It's not like going over the rainbow. So I think you did very, very well. Are we ready to get started? Do you guys need a few minutes?
No, ma'am, we're good.
Okay.
I'm sorry, we were just looking at a document that I needed them to look at this morning. We're good now.
No, that's all right. If you need time for something, I realize life does not stop. And I recorded this last time for your other group, and the young man that's sitting right in front here, what is your name again, sir?
That's LaSavion.
I think that you gave me one of the best stories last week about how you learned about sex. I kind of put them in a little folder, and I saved them, and I got home that night and I said to my husband, okay, I've got a really, really good one. So I told him the story of your grandma and the glass of water, and I said, they're perfect. I get the best stories. So thank you for sharing that.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, let me
Barbara, we do have one new staff with us this morning. Courtney, right here in the back. She listened to last week's with me yesterday, and she's on our other shift of our CCS staff.
Okay, well, welcome, Courtney. All right, let me share my screen with you guys and get this up. It's probably not quite as interesting to listen to this with somebody else talking when you don't get to say anything yourself. So if anybody has anything that they want to share, that's why I did enjoy your group, because you did talk. Otherwise, it's just me talking for 2 hours. So, all right, we did Module A last week, and we're going to do Module B this week, which is understanding and responding to the sexual behavior problems of our kids, which we all have. So I'm just going to recap real quick what we talked about last week. We talked about the difference between normal and abnormal sexual behavior, because there is normal sexual behavior, even with very little children. And when I say how we're raised affects our sense of the sexual self. We all have an identity that we grow up with, a cultural identity, a racial identity, a gender identity, and that identity as to how we see ourselves in the world as whatever gender or however we identify with. And most kids who've been molested have a very distorted sense of this. They have a very distorted sense of what normal is, because they don't know what normal is. And when you don't know what normal is, you're going to act out on whatever your experiences are. And the basic aim of working with sexually distorted kids is to re-educate them as to what this is, what normalcy is, what is a normal life. If you come in and find two kids masturbating each other, for example, which we've certainly had that happen, our job is not to shame them. Our job is not to yell at them. Our job is to try to educate them as to what normal sexuality would be. So that's really the purpose of what why we're doing this. And we're going to go through understanding and how to respond directly to some of these behaviors. You're already using the teaching family model. I understand that your reaccreditation, or whatever you call it, went pretty well. But Micah anticipated it would go well because you guys have done such a good job with that up there. But that whole teaching family model lends to what we're talking about right now. When I referenced the old level system, that was long before Madison came around. I think the level system was many, many years ago, and it hung on way longer than it should have. But the basis for that really was shaming, and it was critiquing kids, and it was the old cottage restriction. If you did something wrong, you were confined to the cottage, and it was just kind of crazy. But it did not lend itself to what we're going to talk about right now. What you guys do is very reaffirming, and I think you'll see that it will lend itself to the kind of interventions that we're going to talk about. So what are our goals for these kids? For one thing, you want to keep the kids safe. You got kids in cottages that have all, probably, in all probability, all had some sexual exposure that may or may not be normal. So we want to make sure that kids are safe, and that's where the sexual safety plans come. I'm assuming that you're using some form of that. We want to make sure that kids get the treatment that they need, and we want to start to re-educate them so that they understand about healthy sexual development. So those are kind of our goals here. But since we went down the Michael Jackson rabbit hole last week, we're going to go down it again. Because for those of you who are younger, you may not remember a lot of the history of what actually happened with Michael Jackson, beyond the fact that he obviously was a musical icon. But he had a very, very troubled history. And many of the victims of sexual abuse of Michael Jackson did not come forward until after he died. And then, of course, after he died, there was this whole position of the Jackson family that these people were just looking for money. But it's far deeper than that. And in 2019, I'm going to show you an interview from the CBS Morning News. Gayle King did the interview. And it's two young men who look, I'm guessing, are probably in their early 30s. I think this was done in 2019. And they were suing the Michael Jackson estate. And the Jackson family said that they were just liars, that they were looking for money. And in fact, one of them had testified in an earlier trial that Michael Jackson had never touched him. So I want you to really watch this and listen to what they're saying, because there are kind of two types of sexual abuse. There's that awful rapey kind of stuff where kids are hurt and really injured by the people that abuse them. And then there is the more incestuous form, which is a lot of what you may be dealing with that may be a little confusing for the kids that you're working with, who may or may not really understand that they have been sexually abused, because it doesn't always look like what you think it looks like. So let's watch the interview and then we're going to talk about it.
Only on CBS this morning, two men who say that Michael Jackson sexually abused them as children are opening up about their experiences with the pop icon. Wade Robson and James Safechuck are featured in an explosive new documentary that premieres this weekend on HBO. Both men also sued the Jackson estate, but their lawsuits were dismissed because of the statute of limitations. They are appealing that. Jackson has always denied any inappropriate behavior with children. Robson and Safechuck told us about their relationships with Jackson, including very graphic allegations of abuse. A warning here, some of these details are quite disturbing. Before you all met Michael Jackson, what did he mean to you?
I saw the making of Thriller, just instantly became obsessed. I wanted to be just like, and I dressed like him every day, and had my hair permed to look like him, and all that stuff.
I wasn't necessarily a big fan, and then when I got the commercial,
Mr. Jackson?
they did
Pepsi commercial.
Yeah, the Pepsi commercial. When the singing weekend was actually my first time seeing him. At that point I was pretty excited. It was otherworldly, I guess.
James Safechuck and Wade Robson discussed the intimate details of their relationships with Michael Jackson
Everybody wanted to meet Michael or be with Michael.
in the upcoming HBO documentary Leaving Neverland. That's the name of Jackson's ranch, where Robson claims 7 years of sexual abuse with the world-famous performer first began.
I mean, this was just the most magical thing I'd ever seen. And that first night, Michael kind of took us on a little bit of a tour, and he said to me and my sister, "You can stay in one of the guest rooms, or you can stay in here with me if you want." And my reaction was, of course, I want to stay with you. We had one more night that way. Myself and my family were going to leave and go on another kind of vacation to the Grand Canyon. I was devastated to leave Michael. Michael was devastated for me to leave. He actually sobbed.
So you got to stay.
So I got to stay. And so it was just Michael and I in Neverland for the next week.
And your parents allowed that?
My parents allowed that. Within either the first or second night of Michael and I being alone at Neverland, the night started changing. One of the ways I remember it starting is, Michael just sort of starting to touch my legs and touch my crotch over my pants. It progressed to him performing oral sex on me, him showing me how to perform oral sex on him.
Did it scare you? Did you think it was wrong?
A couple days prior to the abuse starting, he started touching me, just in the sense of like hand on my leg, lots of hugs, kissing my forehead, rubbing my hands. So there had been this kind of development of physical closeness that was happening already that felt like a father. It just felt amazing. As Michael started doing these sexual acts, he started talking to me about God brought us together. We love each other, and this is how we
love each other.
We love each other, and this is how we show each other our love.
James, you're nodding in agreement to what he's saying. Tell me what happened to you.
He introduced me to masturbation. He said I taught him how to French kiss. And then it moves on to oral sex.
Are you frightened or thinking this is weird or wrong?
No, it's in the context of a loving, close relationship. There's no alarm bells going off in your head or any thoughts like that. Really, it's just, I love this person and we're trying to make each other happy. He said, I was his first, but even as a kid, you don't even know what that means. So you're lovers and you're best friends.
What does that mean, James? You're in a relationship and you're lovers. You're a little boy,
Right.
And he's a 30-something man, and you're a little boy. Because at that age, how do you even know what that means?
You don't. You just feel really connected to someone and you just love them intensely.
The public in general thinks it's violent, that it's very painful, but what you're describing is totally the opposite of that.
He didn't beat me. He didn't, he never said mean things to me. It was all, we love each other.
In spite of what they're claiming today, in 1993, both Robson and Safechuck denied being molested by Jackson when allegations were brought by another boy, Jordan Chandler. That case settled out of court. You all both tell a very descriptive story about sexual activity with Michael Jackson. Yet, when you were asked to testify in 2005, And Wade, you did. You got on the stand and you testified in his back and vehemently denied that any sexual activity had taken place.
Yes.
Why did you do that?
The training, Michael's training of me to testify began the first night that he started abusing me. He started telling me that if anybody else ever finds out, we'll both go to jail. Both of our lives will be over.
The 2005 criminal trial of Michael Jackson centered on molestation charges brought by a child cancer survivor named Gavin Arvizo. Court testimony shows that from the stand, Wade Robson denied ever kissing, showering, or even cuddling with Jackson. You know, they credit your testimony in part for Michael's acquittal. You know, you were called really a star witness. You withstood a blistering cross-examination, and he was acquitted. On some level, do you feel guilty about that now? Do you think about that?
Yeah, I do think about that. I have, and I do. I wish that I was ready. I wish that I could have helped Gavin Arvizo receive some justice and some validation for what happened to him. It was just like what happened to me and just like what happened to James. And I wish that I could have played a role in, at that point, stopping Michael from abusing however many other kids he did after that.
Do you think that there are others out there?
I do think there are others out there, but I also don't expect them to just come out now that we're coming out. It's such a difficult thing to do, to come out. You have to do it when you're ready.
We can't change what happened to us. It happened, it's done. But what can we do with it now? How can we provide comfort for other survivors? That's what this is about. And Michael just happens to be the guy, the abuser in this child sexual abuse story.
Now, you know, we talked to the Jackson family yesterday, and they say these men, we should point out again, according to the Jackson family, they're admitted liars and opportunists who are now trying to capitalize on Michael Jackson's death and exploit the Jackson name. Neither one of these men were paid for appearing in the documentary. They will get nothing for appearing, but they think it's important, they say, to tell their story. And they want people to know. And I thought it was interesting when they said, when you think of child sexual abuse, you think that it's a very frightening, painful thing. But for them, they didn't even know that anything wrong was happening to them because they're little boys.
You can't overlook the detail that they provided about how that relationship evolved.
And what's so powerful about the detail is not the acts, it's the narrative and the fact that both of them didn't know each other and the fact that they both heard a version of the same very surprising and complicated narrative from, or they claim from Michael Jackson, and that those two things are similar.
And each one of them said they thought they were the only one in keeping the secret. Keeping the secret is the thing that often takes you down.
I've said it before,
We've had a lot of problems
abuse
since
fosters in silence.
Exactly.
And it's only until people begin to speak out about it and expose it that it starts to end.
And that's why they're speaking up.
Okay. Does anybody have any reaction to what you heard these two young men saying?
I think the reaction in the room was that it was disturbing to hear a couple of things. One, of course, the sexual acts, and that he was telling them that it was love, which we know is a pretty common thing and theme for offenders. But I think the other thing that struck me in particular was his parents were going on vacation, and because he threw a fit, they just let him stay. They're like, oh, yeah, you can stay with this whole grown man and nobody's supervising it. Okay, that sounds like great parenting. No, that would have been a hard no for me as a parent. But they just said it was okay and let him stay.
You know, that's one of the things that always jumps out at me about this particular interview. Remember, this happened in 1993, and because I was in the field at that point, I watched all this evolve. In 1993, there was not that much common thinking that this could happen. Even 10 years ago, when I first put this thing together, which I think was in 2009, we still had foster parents who were allowing their foster children to babysit their younger children. The 14-year-old foster boy would, in fact, that's one of the examples from this, is going to take care of the 6-year-old daughter. There was never a lot of conscious thought that this kind of thing could happen. And remember, These two little boys were in the entertainment industry. So one of them was in a Pepsi commercial, and I don't know what the other one did. It wasn't real clear, but clearly they were both in the entertainment industry, which is why he invited them to come to begin with. And think of a stage mother in the entertainment industry saying, oh, Michael Jackson had my child for a whole week. That was like a whole big thing. Everybody was enamored with Michael Jackson. Nobody ever thought that he would do anything like this, which is why he repeatedly got away with it. He was repeatedly exonerated. It was very, very common for like these two young men. This guy was probably quite young in 2005 when he had to testify that Michael Jackson never hurt him and never did any of this to him. So can a 30-year-old and a 5-year-old be in love? Is that even a possibility?
No.
But this is what he told them. And he was behind that smokescreen of being an incredibly, incredibly famous person. And even as people like me follow these stories because that's my line of work, but even watching him change his appearance over time, when he repeatedly broke his nose to the point where you couldn't even recognize it as a nose, where he lightened his skin, where he straightened his hair, where he did all the things to essentially take the black part of him away. He also repeatedly did things with these kids to make them think that this was a very normal, equal relationship between a 30-year-old man and a 5-year-old boy. So why do you think they did come forward in 2019? Anybody have any thoughts about that?
Get louder, Sean.
Michael Jackson was dead.
Yeah, yes. You know, you guys really pick up on the good points. He was dead. And why do you think they didn't do it while he was still alive? Did you get any sense from these two young men that they still had some sense of longing for him?
Yeah, they'll probably still get paid.
I couldn't hear what you said.
They still had a longing for him, but they was also probably still getting paid for it.
I'm sorry, I just didn't pick up what you said, and I want to make sure I heard you.
She said that they probably do still have longing for him, but there's also financial compensation involved.
Okay, their lawsuits were denied. They were denied because the statute of limitations had run out. And I don't know what happened on the appeal. I know they appealed it because they were only 5 years old and when this happened. And the first boy said it went on for 7 years. So it didn't end until he was 12. They also really didn't understand that this was abuse because he wasn't hurting them. He was very loving with them. And not that we can go back, the man is dead. We don't know what happened to him. But I think it was Neva who said last week, do you think anything happened to him? We really don't know. I mean, when you look at his persona and his behavior, I think he was a very damaged individual. And he was also an individual who grew up in the entertainment industry. And the values around certain things in the entertainment industry, especially when he was a little boy, were pretty distorted. So we have a very, very sad picture of what happened to him. That little clip where he was going into the courthouse and everybody was outside chanting because they wanted him to be acquitted. The whole clip of that is that he comes out of the courthouse and his van is there. And he jumps up on the top of his van. They start playing music. He starts dancing and it's like a street party. So no one really, really believed that he had done any of these things. The point I guess I want you guys to take away from this is that here are two, they appeared to be pretty sound young men, but it was pretty clear that they still had conflicted feelings about him. And they knew as they grew to be adults, they began to realize that this was a wrong thing. But they really still hadn't come to terms with the fact that he didn't hurt them. And they didn't understand how much of this was their fault. You heard the second young man said, Michael told me I taught him how to French kiss. Can a 5-year-old do that? No. I was his first. He didn't even know what that meant until he got older. So what you're going to see, go back to your kids right now. Just think about your kids for a little bit. You're going and probably have seen a lot of kids over time who have really not understood that what happened to them wasn't a normal thing that had happened to them. And because they don't understand that, that's where a lot of the sexual acting out comes in, the kind of provocative behavior. It's also why it's so easy to suck your kids into human trafficking. And that's a whole other training. But the statistics on human trafficking, which used to scare the life out of me when I worked at FUMSH, was that if you, especially as a young female, run away from your campus and you're gone for more than 48 hours, you have a 75% chance of being trafficked within those 48 hours. Those are pretty scary thoughts. So, but why is it so easy? It's so easy because they're just used to that kind of behavior, and they're used to that kind of attention, and they don't always understand that it's wrong. Let me ask you, you don't have to tell me anybody's names, but of the kids that you have in your campus right now, do you have any that you know were victims of incest?
Yes.
Can you tell me just a little bit about the story?
We have an 11-year-old female who, the reports of incest are that it was her grandfather, her brother, and then her father.
Okay. And how old is she?
11.
She's 11 right now, but when it first, they were in care before when she was 4. And at that time, it was the brother and the grandfather. And then
Okay.
she came to care again at the beginning of this year, and it was the brother and the father.
Did she go back home in between the first placement and the second placement?
Yes.
Super. And what kind of behaviors do you see her manifesting?
She's 11, but she's attracted to older girls.
Okay.
She's been talking a lot about feeling horny.
Okay.
Talks about missing her father a lot. Some of those details on what she misses of her dad, it's like jumping on his stomach and his hugs. So a lot of the affectionate things.
Mm-hmm. You know,
I think the one that disturbs the group in the conference room the most is when she talks about how he gave the best back rubs, and how when they would tickle fight, it was the most fun.
Just let me unshare the screen just a minute so I can see you guys a little bit better. Yeah, it is really uncomfortable stuff. I can tell you that. We all know that. And I can also tell you very clearly that incest is much harder to deal with than that good old-fashioned rape. It's much harder to deal with because listen to what you're saying about this 11-year-old. She doesn't hate her father. She's not even, it sounds to me like what she's giving you is her attempt to make the good father more present for her. The father that played with her, the father that gave her back rubs, even though we all know that after those back rubs came something else. But she's not telling you what happened after the back rubs. She's kind of giving you a good father would do these kinds of things. A good father would let me tickle fight with him. A good father would let me play with him. Even though the good father is the one that had sex with her. It's a lot more difficult when I do my trainings with my therapists here, and we talk about, because you know, that's our job. So we talk about a lot of the kind of gruesome details of what these kids share and how uncomfortable it is to sit there and sit on your hands while they're telling you these stories so that you don't look horrified when they're telling you the stories, because you don't want to look horrified or they won't tell you the stories. So, but if you've hopefully been raised in a quasi-normal environment, it's hard stuff to listen to. And that's kind of what one of the points that we're going to make here today is that this is not easy stuff. And it's not easy, and it's okay if you have bad reactions inside yourself to some of this. It's perfectly okay. What you don't want to do is say, he did what? Because then they'll never tell you anything again. And that was one of the mistakes that I made very early in my time at FUMSH. I think I'd maybe been there for a month. And one of the 13-year-old girls told me about her father, who had pimped her out. They lived in a little rural town, and she was 9. And she said, well, he did this. And then his girlfriend got pregnant, and he made me abort the baby with a turkey baster. And that was when I said, he did what? And then I said, okay, you got to step back here a little bit and calm down. So then I used to sit like this so that I didn't do it until I could get myself to the point where I wouldn't do it. So it's tough stuff.
Shahagini said when we started talking, she's like, this just hurts my heart. And I think that's the reality is where therapists get a lot more training in how they gauge their reaction to it. That's what I think I appreciate about this training is it gives us an opportunity to learn how to fix our faces and get our hearts ready for hearing these really painful stories, because the kids share as much in the cottage in that setting when they're escalated or upset, I think sometimes as they do in therapy, and we're blowing up Alexis's phone saying, hey, we've heard this, this, and this. But it's hard for cottage staff because we don't have that level of training of this is how you're going to close this off in your professional mind and try to just get through the story with them. So I appreciate the fact that we're doing this training.
Well, it's very well put. And think about Alexa. Alexa doesn't have any peers up there. So I think you guys are.
State Recreation Pier, Gorliston South Pier Lighthouse, Olcott Light, Coconut Bay Fishing Pier.
Alexa, stop. I'm sorry. I'm gonna. Do you have a middle name? Can I use another name?
Marie.
All right. Henceforth, you're going to be Marie, because every time I address you, this thing goes off on me. Because you don't have a peer up there, you don't have anybody to bounce this stuff off either. And I can honestly tell you, for the childcare staff, you're with them all the time. If anybody's going to get the stories, it's going to be you guys. So, I mean, when I was a therapist at FUMSH, I had them maybe 2 hours a week. You have them all the time. So your chances of hearing this stuff are far greater. And your reactions, as we're going to talk about, are critical. And in all of the time that I trained on the Enterprise campus, the therapists, well, Alexa, I'm sorry, Marie, you came to my trainings, but all right, stop. But the therapist didn't. If you recall that, the therapist never came. It was always the childcare staff. And we talked a lot about how are you going to react to your kids when they tell you these stories, because you're the one that's going to hear them. So, and that's why I appreciate you guys letting me do this, because we don't have much of an opportunity to do training with the childcare staff anymore. I did it for years, and then I don't know why they stopped it, but they did. So, all right, let's go back to this. I always find it's wise after the Michael Jackson interview to let that shake out a little bit before we go forward. Michael Jackson is a very sad example of what happens. Actually, it happens in the entertainment industry. It happens in all industries. But he had the perfect breeding ground to do this, because any of those little boys came mostly from entertainment families. And the cancer survivor that they talked about, he would invite, always boys, he would invite boys and their families to come to stay at Neverland. And you remember where Neverland came from. Neverland was where Peter Pan grew up, and he never grew up, and that was Michael Jackson. So lots more on YouTube if you're interested to the end of that sad story. Okay, as we said, it is perfectly okay for you to have reactions to things like this. So usually we kind of look at some of the common myths or not myths of about sexual abuse. But usually people that are in your field have fairly normal reactions to this. You do this with different groups and you don't. So let's just look at some of these things, and I want you to kind of tell me how you might react to some of these statements. Usually reports of children engaging in sexually abusive activities are way blown out of proportion. They don't happen that much. And the correlate to that is that if a kid acts out sexually, it's not because something happened to him or her, it's because they're just bad children. And we get that a lot, especially from foster parents. Second is that adults need to expect some kind of sexual play among children. Should we expect them, normal, everyday kids, to do anything sexual as they grow up? We can expect children who have been abused and neglected to engage in abusive behaviors towards others. Is that something that we should look for? Is that something that we should expect? The majority of persons who have experienced childhood sexual abuse do not become adolescent or adult sex offenders. Do we think that kids who have been exposed to sexual abuse are always going to become sex offenders? And the last is that children are exposed to too much sexual information, and the less we talk about this, the better off we will all be. So would anybody like to take any of these? And there are no...
I'd like to do number 5. Kids are exposed to too much sexual information. The less talk about sex, the better. I think I would say kids are exposed to too much incorrect sexual information.
Right.
And they need adults in their day who will talk about sex in a meaningful way, both the correct naming of body parts and a real discussion on what the mechanics of sex look like and the biological ramifications, not just what they might hear from their friends or see on TV or things like that. Like, of course, there's always the emotional component to sex, but I think we have to have really healthy conversations about sex from the biological standpoint. Like, this is biologically appropriate, or this is biologically normal. This is driven by your biology of where you are in your development. But I hate when we don't call a penis, and we have some cute little name for the vagina. It drives me absolutely crazy, because then you say those words, especially to our kids, and they're like, oh, that's a gross word. Why do you use that word? So I did number 5. Everybody else can take a different number.
I said number 4, the majority of persons who've experienced child sexual abuse do not become adolescent or sex offenders. Most of them don't, if they get the right help early on. But I think the ones who think that they can heal themselves and don't think that it's an issue kind of sometimes do, that I've noticed in my personal life.
Yeah, statistically, there are very, very few children who are molested who grow up to be sex offenders. It's like less than 5%. But I think what you're saying is probably true, that if you have no remediation, no treatment, if nobody tells you that what happened to you was wrong, then you might possibly act out. I think I showed you, where is it? Hold on, let me unshare just for a second. This book that I have in my library, that happens to boys too, is a very old book. And the reason I keep it is because there's almost no books written about boys who've been molested. But this was done in 1986 and in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And it was women from a rape crisis center that went to Summers Correctional Institute in Connecticut. And the men who were in the sex offenders unit volunteered to talk to them about their stories. And these particular men had all become adult sex offenders. But as they talked about their stories, they directly, they drew a direct line from their own childhood sexual abuse to their then growing up and acting out. And it's a remarkable book. And we use it a lot with our kids. But the fact is that it's very, very rare for childhood abuse victims to turn into sex offenders. And those who don't or those who do can usually equate it to the fact that they didn't receive treatment. So your point is very well taken. And I want to go back to Neva just for a sec. When you say that you want them to use the right language and you want them to have the right education, that's a lot of what your task is as childcare workers, as therapists, as whatever role you play with these kids. You're re-educating them. And the reason that you hear a lot of those cutesy names is that for many, many people, there's discomfort in talking about body parts. But when we talked about how did you learn about sex, most of us don't learn about it from anybody educated. We learn about it from our friends. We see some crazy thing on a streaming service. We see it's very easy to get porn on the internet. We see that kind of stuff. So we don't really understand what it really is. And I think we're going to probably get into this in a little bit, but you guys are in an era where kids are, what's the word I want, exposed to all different kinds of gender orientations that 20 years ago we did not talk about. 20 years ago, when I came to work at FUMSH, these kids had 3 identities. They were either gay, they were straight, or they were bisexual. There was nothing in between. And all of them told me they were bisexual, not because they were bisexual necessarily, but because it was easier to do what they did. But there's a lot of information and a lot of confusing information that comes out in the media that your kids are exposed to every day. The last time we did a training here for the therapists on working with LGBTQ kids, I had to get a whole glossary of terms that I could share with the therapists because half of us didn't know what half of the words meant. So I think Neva's right. The more you give them good education, the better off you are. What about this one? Adults need to expect some sexual play among children.
I'll take that one. I think it goes back to what you guys talked about in last week's training about how there's abnormal and normal.
Right.
So expect younger kids to be curious, so they explore curiously, like amongst themselves, or once they start to wonder or learn that boys have different parts than girls, they might be like, oh, well, what's your part look like? Because they're curious. But there's a difference between abnormal and normal.
Absolutely, and you probably see the abnormal, so you know what the abnormal is. We all grew up with a certain sense of sexuality. And depending on how your families handled it, it was either something that you didn't ever talk about, but it was still there. So, but yeah, you're right. I'm glad we did that chart last week. What about we can expect children who have been abused and neglected to engage in abusive behaviors towards others? This one's a little bit more complicated. Anybody want to take a stab at that one?
For me, and this is Neva, for me, I think I think here what we've seen more is kids that have had physical trauma, like been physically abused, beaten, things like that. We've seen more of that. We've been pretty fortunate into not seeing a lot of the sexual acting out that might come from it. We get a lot of talk. We haven't had a lot of action, but we do get a lot of talk. And so we haven't seen a lot of child on child, what I would describe as sexually abusive behaviors in that realm. And I haven't been here super long, but I think we see more of the physical aggression towards violent acts as opposed to sexual acts.
I can say that in my work with TTP as a house parent, I did see it. I don't think it automatically means because you've been abused, you'll be abusive.
Right.
It can happen, and we do have cases in TTP where it did happen, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen. We've also had kids in TTP that they were not abusive, but they were in our program just in case because they were sexually abused, and it never did get to a point where they were abusive towards other people. So
Yeah, I think both of what you're saying is true. You know, I think we can expect that it's a possibility. It's not a given, but it is a possibility. I think what Neva's talking about, and actually what you're both talking about, are triggers. These kids have triggers, and those triggers cause them to act out in certain ways. One of the things that I certainly saw a lot on the main campus, especially with the boys are going to react differently than girls. And boys who have been hurt are much more apt to act out in that way. So we don't have to expect it. We should just be on the lookout for it. For those of you who remember the very sad incidents that happened with the 2 kids who ran away from the main campus in 2021 and are now in, I think, permanent lockup. Both of those kids had dreadful, dreadful histories. And the girl was, I think the girl was 14 at the time and the boy was 12 when they ran away and got into the guy's house down the street and got the guns and were shooting at the police officers, which is pretty much an extreme reaction to what had happened to them. Did they want to kill those officers? I don't think so. I think they thought they were terribly triggered and they were in some kind of a fantasy about, I forget what the name of the thing was.
GTA, Grand Theft Auto.
Grand Theft Auto, right. And they're in this situation. I think they were incredibly triggered. I think they got into this fantasy of Grand Theft Auto. And obviously, their lives are probably not going to turn around at this point. The boy is in, I forget what level lockup he's in until he can get out when he's 18. And Nicole hasn't been tried yet, but because she is who she is, she has asked for a trial. She will more than likely be found guilty and end up in a lockup for the foreseeable future. But those are kind of extreme reactions to trauma triggers. But usually when kids do any kind of sexual acting out, whether it's turning on themselves, whether it's them being provocative and getting on, sending out pictures of themselves without clothes on or whatever it is that they do, it's usually a reaction to something that's happened. The other thing I'd say too, and I don't know about the ones that you have, but when we get them in outpatient, when they have done any kind of child-on-child acting out, we get them after. So our job at that point is to try to remediate, teach them proper sexual behavior with their siblings and anybody else. So, and your example about your incest victim is pretty telling, because in going back to the way those guys reacted to Michael Jackson, you've got a prime example there with an 11-year-old girl who really is still not sure how to feel about her father. So those are tough cases to work with, and we have to really walk a fine line, because what do? Do you say, you know, your dad shouldn't have done that, and then you're really kind of stepping into her world where she is conflicted about her father? So if you think that you are having strong reactions to what she says, of course you are. It's kind of the way you deal with it that's important. And if I had a magic answer for that, I would tell you. I can tell you most frequently what I do with that, with kids, as they begin to tell me things like, oh, he gave the best back rubs and whatever, is to try to let them talk enough to say, do you think that other dads do that? More than likely, she knows other dads don't do that. but it takes a while to get there. So when we say we can expect childhood victims to have some abnormal behaviors, the problem that we have had in the past is that when girls act out sexually, when girls run away and they end up being trafficked, or they end up in situations where they are then further abused, the stance of law enforcement up until about 10, 15 years ago was that these kids were child prostitutes. It wasn't that long ago that when kids who had been trafficked under the age of 18 were not put in treatment, they were arrested as prostitutes. And we now have the Safe Harbor Act, which I think went in 2003, which says that nobody under the age of 18 can consent to sex. Therefore, regardless of what you are doing, regardless of the fact that you ran away from Madison and got picked up by a truck driver and ended up in a human trafficking circle, it does not make you a child prostitute. It doesn't make you a juvenile sex offender. You cannot consent to that. But before then, they were always arrested. They were arrested far more than their pimps. So we have come some ways, I guess. Not sure, but we have. So if you don't remember anything else, and somebody at the back of the room said it, I can't always see you super good, so I apologize if I don't get your name right. But we have to remember that kids who are sexually reactive are not going to be adult sex offenders. Not necessarily. It's a very slim percentage. I'll show you a little video about that. But we have to remember that, because it was not that long ago that there's a very large treatment facility in Orlando called the University Behavioral Center, and they were doing adult sex offender treatment with juveniles who had committed sexual acts. And the absolute worst thing you can do for a youth who has engaged in sexually reactive behavior is to subject them to adult sex offender treatment. Because what is adult sex offender treatment? That really implies that, number one, you know what you're doing. Number two, you are out to harm your victims. And the purpose of your treatment is for you to admit that and to accept your guilt. That's the whole shtick for adult sex offender treatment. You don't want to do that to a kid who has had some exposure and has acted out sexually. So we have to always remember that, especially with your boys. All right, I'm going to show you another little video which talks about the danger of labeling kids as sex offenders. Let's just watch this, and then I would like you to give me your reactions to this.
I'm not a monster. I'm a person that made mistakes. I was a child, and I didn't even know what I was doing.
We all want to protect children. Listing juveniles on the public sex offender registry doesn't protect anyone. Putting their name and their faces and their address on the public registry devastates entire families.
We were playing with dolls, and the dolls were kissing, then we were kissing, and then it led to little fondling, you know, over the clothes, under the clothes. That was it, but obviously that was enough to convict. I was 12 and she was 8. I was during the summer, and I, experimented and did some things that shouldn't have done, but I didn't know. I didn't know the consequences. I thought something like this came with a grounding or a spanking. I was still that young. I've spent maybe close to 8 years behind bars. I was young, man. When you hear sex offender, you don't think it's a 12-year-old little boy that's crying himself to sleep in a juvenile cell.
Most people think if you're on a registry, you're definitely dangerous. And so, but it's really, the real fact about it is that there's a broad range of offenses that can place a person, or especially a child, on the registry.
Who's your son?
We all want to keep our children safe. The problem is that the laws are based on faulty assumptions. They're based on the assumption that children and adolescents who commit sex offenses are at high risk to commit more sex offenses. This isn't true. There are many studies, there's been over 30 that show low recidivism rates for youth who have sexually offended. That's the main point of registration and notification, is to reduce sexual recidivism. And that does not work.
I was a child. I was misunderstood. I did something wrong, yes. Punish me appropriately. But don't throw me into a den of lions.
And I can understand paying some sort of price for doing something that wasn't right, but absolutely not have them put on the public registry and to have their names in all of the local newspapers and then expect them to go to school and mingle with the other kids.
The police will publish your information on the official website. In some states, they'll make mailers, they'll make flyers. Sometimes it's lawn signs saying sex offender lives here.
And all the neighbors were handed out pamphlets describing my sons in the house and where the sex offenders live. Vigilante groups coming to my house, the Molotov cocktail thrown at the house. The holes are still there around the bedroom window where the BBs went through the vinyl siding on the house. They were 11 and 13 years old.
A person on the registry, even if it's a person that's 11 years old, 12 years old, 13 years old, cannot enter or live in zones that are frequented by children, meaning a park, a daycare, a nursery, a school.
I found it hard to find a place to live. It's been difficult to keep jobs. I dropped out of college because of the registry. The registry also directly affects my own children, my wife. We have moved 9 different times in the past 3 years. They've been in 4 or 5 different schools. That makes me feel like a horrible parent because I can't give my children what they need.
No matter how hard they're trying right now in their lives to get their lives together, it's never going to go away. You just Google up their names and up comes all the sex offender information. For what happened when they were 10 and 12 years old is turning out to be a life sentence.
This person has this label for the rest of their life based on something that they did when they were a child.
Juveniles should not be subjected to registration or notification. In the absence of any supportive evidence whatsoever that there's a community safety effect, youth should be protected from these laws.
Okay, why don't we take a 10-minute break, because I'd like to go get some coffee, and then we'll talk a little bit about this video. And so maybe 10 after 10, is that okay?
Sounds great, thank you.
Thank you.
This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, you ready to get started?
Yes, ma'am. We're good.
Oh, all right. Currently, and I haven't checked this law statute for a while, but currently, in order to be considered in Florida a juvenile sex offender, you have to be 13 or up, and you have been convicted of a crime. That has tightened up over the years because it got as low as 9, where kids were being labeled as juvenile sex offenders. And the whole thing about the registry, all states have registries, but these little Facebook groups, like I live in Glen Abbey, so there's a Glen Abbey Neighbors Digest, whatever, and I look on them from time to time. And if you don't know anything about this field, if you're out of this field, if you've never had any exposure, you're just some little woman living in Glen Abbey who's got 6 kids or whatever, you can get really sucked into these registries. And I have seen people do that, where they will, somebody posted a while ago, I just put my address into the sex offender registry and there are 10 people within 5 miles of me that are adult sex offenders. So of course people lose their minds about stuff like that. And they've been misused over the years. But what you saw there were I think there were 3 or 4 different people talking about their kids. I think that was filmed in Texas. And the father who said that the vigilantes came and shot the BBs at his house, his kids were 10 and 12. So does anybody have any comments about that video? Or any thoughts about those people who said, I was just a child?
Neva, we can't hear you.
Because she keeps turning the
I
mic.
forget that there are 2 microphones for this, so it's crazy. I think we're just still all processing that particular video because we know what happens to kids, and we know that the kids we deal with in certain circumstances where could easily end up in the hands of law enforcement. So we're just.
The registries were meant to do some good, but there's no reparation with a registry. There's no, okay, you went to treatment, you dealt with your issues, you served your time in prison, whatever. There's no reparation. You're just on the registry, and you're on the registry forever. And people don't always understand when they look on it what that's all about. But think about the first boy who said, I think he was talking about playing with his sister, and that the dolls were kissing, and then they were kissing. And is that sex offender behavior? Where does that fall? Let me just ask it this way. Where does that fall in that continuum between normal sexual behavior and abnormal sexual behavior?
Say it louder.
Abnormal.
It starts out okay, doesn't it? It just kind of veers. It veers into abnormal because they began to sexually act out with each other. But I'm here to tell you, from an outpatient standpoint, we get a lot of boys, brothers who have acted out somewhat sexually on their little sisters. And it's almost always in like boys that are in that 12 to 14 age range, as these boys were. And then with little sisters that are 6 or 7. And if you grew up with your siblings, if you were in the house and you were playing together, it was very easy for things to kind of get out of hand, whether you were tickling each other, or you were arm wrestling with each other, or you were playing with each other. But I'm here to tell you that tickling and arm wrestling and all of that stuff is just kind of the beginnings of innocent sex play. It can veer, and it can get out of hand kind of quickly. But these were all boys who were then arrested and convicted, who didn't even really know what they had done or why they shouldn't have done it. And when the second boy says he was 12 and he ended up in a juvenile facility for 8 years, that's a long time for any kind of sexual offense. So the point, I guess, of that is that none of this is really black and white. None of this is really just it's this way or it's that way, because sex is on a continuum. And you start out playing with your little sister, your little brother, and you end up in a tickle fight, and all of that sort of kind of stuff happens. And you're 11 or 12, and you're beginning to go into puberty, and you're beginning to feel a little bit of sexual urges, and the only one in the room with you is your little sister. That stuff happens. It's really up to the job of the caretakers to say, okay, let's not do that. She's too little for you to tickle fight with, or you're too big to tickle fight with her. That's the job of caretakers. Your kids usually have come to you without a lot of decent caretaking. So it's very easy for them to not understand some of the things that they've done or may have been exposed to. Now let me get back into this again. I won't show you any more videos today. I think I've overdosed you on the videos, and when you tell me you need time to process things, that tells me that I've probably shown you enough videos for one day. So All right, what are we looking at, and why do kids get into sexual behavioral problems? Your kids have all of this stuff, don't they? They usually have not had a lot of developmental caretaking. And when I say that, I mean your kids can often come to you not understanding, maybe they're 11, but they have the vocabulary of a 5-year-old. Why do kids have less than age appropriate vocabularies? Because nobody's talked to them. Many of your kids come from homes where people are not sitting and talking to them and helping them to know that, okay, the next step of your development is maybe to learn how, as a young lady, to use deodorant, or to learn how to brush your hair, or to learn how to do certain developmental skills that any 12-year-old would know how to do. They don't come with that. They certainly don't come with a lot of social skills. With a lot of these kids, they've just been raised with without appropriate role models. How do you learn what social skills are? How do you learn how to sit at a table and eat a meal with other people, or how to behave normally with other people in social settings? They don't have a lot of that. And certainly a lot of it comes from learned behavior. What do I mean by sexual confusion? Especially now.
How they identify either as their gender identity or their sexual orientation and preferences.
You know, I wouldn't want to be an 11 or 12-year-old or any teenager growing up right now, because there is so much on social media. There's so much about sexual identity, and the vocabulary that is used now. Who did I see? Do any of us really care that Miley Cyrus is pansexual? Number one, I don't care about Miley Cyrus, but I really don't even 100% sure I know what pansexual is, because a lot of those terms are getting used interchangeably, and it's confusing for kids. I went to Walmart 2 days ago to get a flu shot, and when I had to sign up on the identity, it asked, one of the questions was gender assigned at birth. Which gender was assigned to you at birth? Now, basically, there's only 2 choices, but I was kind of confused as to why that was even there. But it's probably Walmart's way of moving a little bit along the continuum. When I went, I had some medical procedure. I don't go to the doctor too much, but one of the questions on that identity was it gender? What gender do you identify with? And so you could write whatever you wanted in there. We just changed our biopsychosocial form here to include 2 questions. One is sexual identity and one is gender orientation. And the reason that we did it was because so many of our young kids were coming to us either acting out like they were sexually confused, or trying to either not talk about it or talk about it with the therapist. So we put the 2 questions on there, and I think it was like for sexual gender orientation might have been male, female, don't want to disclose, or don't know. It gave them a little range. And it was just to say to our kids, it's okay if you want to talk about this. You don't have to talk about it, but it's okay if you want to talk about it. But who do you think I had the most trouble with those 2 questions? Was it the kids, or was it the therapist?
It's the therapist. It's always the adult.
Right, it absolutely was. So I'll get to that point in the bio, and I'll go to the therapist and say, did you forget to fill this out? Well, they didn't forget to fill it out. They just wouldn't ask the questions. So it's, hold on a second.
I'm sorry, our little machine here is making some weird noises.
I think it's my phone. It just did it stop? Did it stop?
No, it was our phone, because our phone often does odd things.
Oh, well, so does ours. So it was ringing, but it's not ringing now. But yeah, the therapist had a really hard time with that. And we just did it actually, and I'm not bringing in DeSantis because I like him or don't like him or whatever, but it was right around the time that he got into this whole don't say gay thing. And then his Secretary of Health and Human Services is a guy named Ladapo, and he put out a statement saying that we as the mental health community should not discuss gender orientation, and we should not endorse gender affirming treatment. And then Medicaid, the Florida Medicaid put out a similar statement, to the point where the American Counseling Association, NASW, and whoever it is that's in charge of marriage and family, all had to put out their own statements saying, we don't have to do this. This is against our ethical standards. We're supposed to work with the child on their own terms. And it's the first time in my entire time of running an agency that I had to put out a political statement to my therapist saying, regardless of how you feel about this issue, your job is to take care of what's best for your client, not what the political climate is telling you to do, not what this guy named Ladapo, who didn't even understand COVID, is telling you to do, and not what ACA is telling you to do. Your job is to take care of your clients. So if you think the kids have sexual confusion, we have a whole political administration that is confused about the issue. But all of your kids are going to have all of those things. They can't avoid it. That's why they're with you. So sexually abused kids really usually have all of these things going on. And as your 11-year-old girl who has been molested by, it sounds like her whole life, by different members of her household, she may or may not even 100% understand that this behavior is inappropriate. And let me say a little bit about incest, because give me a good sexual abuse case any day over an incest case. Incest cases are so hard, and they raise a lot of feelings in all of us that we have to grapple with, and they are almost always intergenerational. So if you really get into that 11-year-old girl's history, if you get the comprehensive behavioral health assessment, if you get some prior history to her, you will probably more than likely find out that this goes back a few generations. That if you've got a grandfather, a father, and a brother, you're really talking about 3 generations right there. So more than likely it went back farther than that. And those are very hard to deal with, because think about your 11-year-old now, because you said she came in when she was 4 the first time, and then went back out, went home again, came back in again, without having any idea what caused the removals, because sometimes the actual removal doesn't have to do with the incest. This child at this point has spent her whole young life in that world and doesn't necessarily understand it. So over the years, some of the hardest cases that I have had to deal with have been incest cases. And they are often start out the way the Michael Jackson one did, although they can go off the rails pretty quickly. But with a lot of these kids, their dads, their uncles, their grandfathers, or whoever say to them, this is our little secret. You don't have to tell anybody. If you tell anybody, you're going to get in trouble. If you tell anybody, I'll get in trouble. If you tell anybody, they're going to take me away, and then I'll never be able to take care of you again. So there's a lot of kind of mental manipulation that goes on with all this stuff. There's also the mental manipulation of saying all fathers are going to teach their daughters how to have sex. One of the biggest excuses that I have heard in certain communities over the years is that the Bible tells you to do this. And I don't know what your Bible says, but mine doesn't say that. So they are hard cases to deal with, and with your 11-year-old or anybody else that you have. If you have feelings about it, it's okay. It's just how you deal with those feelings. All right, this has somewhat changed over the years. When I say our LGBTQ youth, most kids, when they have any kind of sexual molestation, they're confused about their sexuality. Girls will often tell me that if I didn't dress this way, if I didn't look this way, if I didn't come out in my bathing suit, none of this would have happened, because girls are going to blame themselves. But what is the most common reaction for boys when they have been victimized. Because boys aren't supposed to be victims, are they? We don't teach our little boys how to be victims. So what's the most common reaction you get from boys?
Physical aggression.
Physical aggression is absolutely one of them. But what about their sexual identity?
Oh, they believe they're gay when they're not.
Yeah, they absolutely do. And over the years, it is the most common reaction. And here's why this is more confusing for you folks to have to deal with. That now we have all of this stuff in the media that identifies kids as transgender, that identifies kids as gay, lesbian, pansexual, binary, non-binary, all of these different, whether or not they're true or not, these are all things that kids have to choose from. Where probably 20 years ago, a boy had one choice. The boy was either gay or straight. And once they were molested, they almost always identified as gay. Now, does that necessarily mean that they are? It didn't mean it then, doesn't mean it now. But you have to kind of help them tease through all that. And again, goes back to something that Neva said before. You guys are with them all the time. So you can't save these discussions or this exposure or these stories to the 1 or 2 hours a week that they are going to spend in therapy. You can't do that, which is why we train our foster parents to try to deal with some of these things in the moment, because they're going to happen. So, and it kind of goes back to your saying about sexually acting out or physically acting out. Usually, why does this abusive behavior occur? Kids have to act out how they feel, and if they've been molested and they're feeling sadness or they're ashamed or whatever, they're going to act out because they don't feel like they have any control. And with a lot of the abusive behaviors, be they physically abusive or sexually abusive, it's really attempts for kids to gain a little bit of a sense of control. Does it help? No. One of the things that we do in therapy, once you kind of get a handle on what purpose is this behavior serving for you? What are you gaining out of this behavior? What do you hope to have happen when you get this, when you do this kind of acting out? Then you can kind of get to, well, how can we replace it with something more healthy? But until you know, you don't really know. Unknown caller. Oh my God, this is my day, I guess, to get. Sorry, I turned the phone off. You know, one of the things that we took on as an action item this year was for our therapists when school started was to develop a protocol for working with the quote school shooter. And one of the things that we've discussed as a therapeutic group is what behavior does that acting out, what's the purpose of that behavior? We're just coming off the Nicholas Cruz sentencing. Nicholas Cruz killed 17 kids at Parkland. He's now been sentenced to life without parole. But trying to look at him and figure out what purpose did that behavior serve? What purpose did Ethan Crumley killing 4 kids in Michigan? What purpose did that serve? Trying to look at the school shooter kid as a prototype to try to figure out what does that behavior serve. That's a whole specific kind of kid who has turned their anger towards the school, towards their classmates, towards institutions. And we try to do the same thing with kids who have suffered from some form of molestation. What purpose does that serve? And usually, especially with boys, the acting out physically or the acting out sexually is kind of an attempt to get control over an out of control situation. And the other thing with your kids is that they're always in a heightened state of arousal. It's just there. They're always in that hypervigilant state where they're always looking and scanning the environment for danger. They do it in school, they do it in the cottages, they do it out on the playground. And usually it's just being in that heightened state of arousal all the time causes them to do certain things. Masturbation is a good way to relieve anxiety for a lot of these kids when they're in that heightened state. And if you look around at your kids, although your kids may be calmer than the kids on the Enterprise campus, but I can tell you the kids on the Enterprise campus, you can tell the difference between a kid walking around the Enterprise campus and the normal kid that you see on the street, because there's a certain physicality to these kids. There's a certain awareness of scanning the environment all the time. That's why you don't want to let the kids in some of these cottages without childcare staff watching them out on the play area together, because Bacon was right across the street. I know Neva said you've not been there, but there's a big administration building. And then from my office where I had it, I could see 4 different cottages. So I could see the kids coming out to play. I could see them with each other. And invariably they'd be out there and the childcare staff would be sitting on the porch with their phones and texting and not paying a lot of attention to them. And you could watch that escalation so quickly that one of them would be running and they would bump into another one. And then that kid would snap to, and that kid would hand off this kid. And the next thing you know, it's like all hands on deck, everybody's fighting. So these anxiety behaviors are usually an attempt to gain some kind of control. And it sounds like you do see some of that. Actually, this was a Funch boy. This was a 10-year-old kid. He was a sexually reactive male. He had witnessed some pretty explicit sexual activity. He witnessed some sexual abuse of his sister. And he drew a whole series of pictures, which I still have. And the reason you can see this kind of thing on the other side is that he drew these pictures with pencil, and he drew them on both sides of the lined pad. So it was bleeding through. When I tried to take the picture, I couldn't get this one gone. But what might you notice about this figure?
Say it again, Sean.
Say again?
I said it looks like a gorilla, but I can't see.
Like a gorilla, a Sasquatch, something big and scary.
Yeah, right.
What? It does have boobs and a penis.
It's anatomically accurate.
Yeah.
For somebody that might be an overweight male, he might have both boobs and a penis.
Okay.
Yeah, all of that.
I just looked down at this fellow.
This is the best of the pictures that he drew. The other pictures are pretty bad. Yeah, I used this. I was doing a training for the Daytona Beach Sheriff's Office, and I remember holding this picture up and saying, "Who do you think drew this picture?" Well, they're all cops, of course. So they said, "Oh God, dirtbag. Must have been a man. Must have been a dirtbag." I said it was a 10-year-old boy. And why did he draw this picture? He drew a whole series, and they got worse from here. And he left them in his drawer, and he left the drawer in his bureau open so that the childcare staff could find it. And what was he really trying to do? He was trying to say something happened here, because you're right. This is an anatomically correct, bizarre, whatever it is. When I do art therapy, one of the things that we always look for are certain features. Certainly sexually abused kids almost always draw genitalia on some form or another. I had a little girl draw genitalia on a butterfly. Somebody else, it was Valentine's Day, I guess. So she drew a series of hearts, and then she had genitalia on the bottom of the hearts. And you might see some, like you mentioned the boobs. And this, when I look at this kind of drawing in a mouth, it's usually aggression. And the other thing that kids sometimes draw, and somebody said it looks like what did you say? Was it a gorilla or something else? Is that sometimes kids who really are confused about what life has handed them do not draw pictures of real people. They draw kind of bizarre cartoon-like characters with, these are not human feet, these are not human hands. So even if you knew nothing about this kid, you would look at this picture and go, oh, something happened here. And something did. But this was his way of saying, I need some help here. And you know, if the foster mom had just said, these are just dirty pictures and ripped them up, we would not have gotten to where we got. And I know from talking to Micah that you're a pretty enlightened staff, but I got to tell you that when I first got to FUMSH in 1998, it was a whole different can of worms with childcare. And they had all come from, at that point, a certain church, and they had all been hired together as childcare staff. So they had certain religious beliefs and they had certain things that you had to deal with. But they would find things like this and they would stick them in my box. Or they would find the girl that had the condoms and they would stick the condoms in my box. And there was some book that, it was long before Harry Potter. It was some book that all the kids were reading, and they'd find the book and they'd leave the book in my mailbox. And I can remember at one point saying, why did you take the condoms away from her? Wouldn't you rather that she had them? But that wasn't the answer they wanted to hear. So if you see, if kids give you any kind of clue like this, take it, because kids have all kinds of ways of telling you what happened. I don't know, Alexa, do you use, now don't start talking to me again. Do you use art therapy?
Sometimes.
You get anything out of it?
Sometimes. I remember one time doing a training with you and you mentioned in art, if there are limbs that are really big, then that's a sign of sexual abuse. And there was a resident we had that drew a picture for Neva, and it was a huge head. And as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh, all right, it makes sense. So
well,
sometimes
I didn't know that, Alexis, and I have that picture hanging up in my office because a child drew it for me. But now I'll not look at it ever again in the same way.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, friend, Alexis. Thanks for that.
But that's an area I don't necessarily have a whole lot of training in, and like outside of the obvious from seeing genitalia, then clearly. But outside of that, I'm not always quite sure what I'm looking at with art, so I don't use it too often. It'll mostly be like expression, and we'll kind of talk about what's on there. But I'm not the best at deciphering if it's not super clear, so it's an area I do want to learn more about.
It was probably because it was easy to train in a lot of years ago. It's one of the easiest things to use, but because I always had kids that had been sexualized, they always put it in the pictures. So I've got a whole collection of those pictures. Yeah, I don't put them on my wall, but I've got them. And usually it jumps right out of you. It's like this, it's just gonna jump right out of you. You don't wanna go and, there's a whole bunch of house tree person picking apple from a tree, all of that jazz, which can be very subjective. But when you have a kid who draws a monster figure with a gory mouth and genitalia, that's probably trying to tell you something. The other thing, and I didn't want to overdo it with the pictures because I think you're a sensitive group, and I don't want you to not want me to come back next week. So, but some of the pictures will just jump right out at you, and most of them are ones that I have picked out to use in trainings over the years because they're so obvious. But some of the ones that you might have seen, you just, why did they draw the sun in the sky? I don't know.
When I was a house parent, there were pictures that I would see because we had little boys. And so we had a boy that had a journal. When he started drawing and we opened it, it became very clear what he was drawing. And it just happened to be around the time where he started to spiral as well. So. We
Sure.
knew what we were looking at with that because it was very detailed in what he was drawing.
Yeah, it's usually not too hard to interpret those kinds of things. It really isn't. But, and if anything else, you know, if you have your own kids who draw pictures and, you know, they draw a house and there's a chimney and there's smoke coming out of the chimney and then there's a sun up in the sky and there are flowers all around and there are birds flying, you're not going to go, oh my God. But if you have that picture, you're going to go, oh my goodness, yeah, I should look at that. So. All right, we're going to, and we'll stop after this because I have a feeling that I get to know when I have overdosed you. So, but reacting to the abused child's behavior, there's a way that you would react and there's a way that you should react. And what I want you to get in touch with is that it's okay how you would react. There's just certain things you don't want to do in front of children. But, and these are all my clients. These are all things that happened. Your 14-year-old foster son was severely molested by his father and uncle for several years. He's in treatment. He's making very good progress, but he comes home from a session and he manipulates your 3-year-old daughter behind the couch where he fondles her. This particular situation was a Funch boy. And at the time, Gilbert Cottage was it was East and West Gilbert, was for little boys, this age range boys. And foster mom and childcare workers in the kitchen, and her 3-year-old is in the living room. She's watching television. So, you know, she can see her from the way that cottage is situated. She could see her daughter and everything was fine. And the kid comes in and he'd been in the therapy session. Now, we as therapists are not always good at closing the session. If you have a kid who, and I'll say this to the childcare staff too, you have to know how to close the conversation because you don't want to leave kids raw. So you have, as a therapist, you have a session and you're talking about what happened with dad and father and kids sharing with you that he felt shame and he doesn't know how he feels about his dad. And so he's kind of opened up. That's what happened. He was sort of raw. And I have 2 clocks that I can see in my office. So my whole thing with therapy sessions is that if it's an hour, you're going to spend the first 10 minutes kind of just getting the kid comfortable. You might spend the next 40 minutes doing the meat of the matter. And then you have to spend the last 10 minutes putting that kid back together so that you can send that kid out reasonably buttoned up. Well, that didn't happen. So he came home and he was kind of rattly. And he got behind the couch and said to the little girl, come here. And then he fondled her. Well, he'd hurt her. And she just, by the time the foster mother looked out, the kid is now back from behind the couch and she's sitting watching television again because she didn't think anything of it. She was a little girl. But apparently, eventually told her mom that so-and-so had me come behind the couch and he was tickling me. And so then she said, well, where was he tickling you? Well, obviously he was tickling her in her genital area. So they came over to me and they were tremendously upset. Now, for those of you who have your own children, and a lot of these examples, I want you to think about that. If you come into a childcare setting and you have your own children and they're little like this, the biggest trigger for childcare workers is to have something happen to one of their own kids. And it does happen. So I'll tell you how they reacted. They were really upset. But how do you think you would react and how do you think you should react?
I think if I were the parent of the child that had been fondled, I think I would naturally be very upset. Sure. I think that is, you know, there's a lot of things in the world, and there are things you don't expect, there are things you do expect, and that might be one of the things you don't expect. So I think being very upset would be natural, but I like to believe I would be very upset in an appropriate way so as not to, knowing the child's history, not to flip out on the child. I would not lose my cool with the child. I would not shame the child, but I would definitely contact his therapist or whoever we were working with to have a session, maybe have a family session to try to address that behavior. And I would definitely put some different parameters in place within the home to ensure that there weren't those opportunities in the future.
All of the above. I applaud you. You guys are so much farther along than people were 10 years ago. You have so much more exposure. It's like you said before, how could those parents let that kid stay with Michael Jackson? Well, that was 1993, and people didn't think anything of that. The world has changed a lot in terms of this, and you guys in your profession are so much more aware of what can happen here. But everything you said is true, and that's really, there was nothing wrong with these people being upset. But I will tell you that they did not go crazy on this little boy, that they came over to me and said, what should I do? What should we do? And that's what we did. I don't think he was mine because I can't remember, but we did sit down with the boy. We did talk about what happened. He said that he was really, he recognized that he was in a heightened state of arousal when he left his therapy session. So a good lesson for you guys too, that if somebody tells you something, and often they do it when they're going to bed because they feel vulnerable in bed, that you might want to just try to spend 10 minutes just talking, kind of bringing them out of that and talking a little bit about the fact that they're safe and what can you do to make them feel safe and bringing them into the here and now. Because remember, memories are relived. Traumatic memories are not memories, they're being relived. So you as child care staff really want to bring that kid back to the present and say, you're okay now. This is Wednesday. This is October 19th. This is not happening to you now. Everything is okay, and we're going to keep you safe. So they did. Their reaction was normal, and over time, I have found that the hardest thing to deal with for foster parents or child care staff is any kind of exposure or risk to their own children, and that's the way you should be. You should be careful of your children.
I think what we find really helpful here, Barbara, is if Alexis has had a session where she feels like the child might be escalated post-session, she does an amazing job of communicating that to the on-shift staff. She gives them a call and says, hey, we had a tough session. She doesn't disclose any of the details, but she says, you may want to be on the lookout for self-isolating or self-harm behaviors or whatever, or they're coming back to the cottage really angry. Alexis gives the staff the heads up so that we can, give a child a time to de-escalate or give them additional attention throughout the course of the evening to provide just additional supervision if it's necessary or a listening ear. So I think that's what's really helpful on our campus is Alexis is hyper aware that a kid can leave from her office and the walk down to the cottage is not maybe enough time for them to process before they walk into whatever chaos may be happening in the cottage, and she gives us the heads up.
And I think you guys are a very well-oiled team, which is why I'm glad you're where you are, because it's a lot harder to manipulate and to control this stuff in a larger campus. And it's a lot harder for the therapist, like my outpatient therapist. Of course, I want them all to be very good, but they're not necessarily going to know their foster parents the way you all know each other. And often are not as good sometimes, especially if they're new, at closing the session down. So I'm glad to hear that you all do that, because that's really what is important. And that's what I used to preach to the child care staff at Enterprise, that your therapist should let you know if this kid has left and is still upset. Because sometimes, despite our best efforts, it's hard to put kids back together, especially with tough stuff. So you guys really, I don't think you realize what a good job you're doing up there, but you are. So, all right, is this another one of my children? One of my success stories? Yes, I believe it is. Your 10-year-old foster daughter was rented out as a prostitute by her father to several uncles from the time she was 6. She asks you, her foster father, to read her a story. And while you are reading, she begins to stroke your leg and suddenly reaches down and touches your genital area. This is a composite of several stories, because we have had this happen several times and especially with our adoptive parents who have adopted kids who have had these kinds of exposures. And this usually happens on the very first night in the home. And then you get this kind of crazy phone call saying, what am I going to do? And I don't know what to do. And this is what happened. And what should I have done? So give me your reaction to that story. How do you think, if we let this man be a composite of about 10 guys that I've worked with, how do you think all these guys reacted when this girl tried to stroke his leg and then touched his crotch?
First and foremost, I know for me, as being a foster parent, I don't even go into my foster kids' rooms like that. I stand at the doorway.
Absolutely.
That's one of the things. Even like being here, working on the campus and working with any of our girls, I don't go in their rooms. I'm standing at the door. And if I do have to go to their rooms, they're not in their rooms. Right. They're outside of the room door, or they're in the living room or whatever like that, or they're at school. I'm never where I cannot be seen by another adult. But as far as it goes for this guy, I know he probably felt like weird. Because that would be a weird situation to even be into.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, the guys have a much different code of protective behavior than the women do, as they should. With again, this is sort of a composite guy. One of the situations was an adoptive father. And he said this happened on the first night. I was trying to read her a story and she wanted to sit next to me. So she was sitting next to him. And then she asked him if she could get up on his lap. And, you're an adoptive father. It's your first night. You want to be supportive and nurturing. So he put her up on his lap, and then it all went to hell in a handbasket from there. And what he did was appropriate. He just said, no, honey, that's not what I want you to do. Well, she was confused because she thought it was her first night with this guy, and she had been prostituted from a very young age. So she didn't know anything about what a quotes normal father figure wants. So she did what she was conditioned to do. And he and his wife called me and told me what happened. And then we had to kind of go backwards. And I say, at the match meeting, did they not give you this information? Well, unfortunately, at the match meetings, they don't always give you all the background for your, in fact, a lot of times they don't tell you at all. So had they done that, and had they sat down and said, okay, this little girl is sexualized, she is likely to act out this way, you're going to have to use certain protective mechanisms, maybe this wouldn't have happened. But I'm here to tell you that this is 2022, and some of this stuff, when it happened 20 years ago, we were just not as aware of what we should be doing. And we as helping professionals really needed to pick up the pace to help these poor adoptive parents to understand what these kids were doing. So I don't see that happening now. Now the match meetings are going much better. We do a lot of pre-adoptive and post-adoptive work with families that are taking in kids that have been sexualized. We have a whole series on our YouTube playlist about the sexual safety plan, how to protect and how to work with kids who've been sexualized, a whole lot of stuff to help adoptive and foster parents. But we didn't always have this. But you're absolutely right. You don't go in the room with them. You're not around them. You always have somebody. But do you realize that not that long ago, foster parents were putting girls in cars and driving them places without having another adult in the car, not realizing the risk that they were putting themselves into? So we've come a ways. Okay. Actually, this was a Texas case. This kid was in a foster home in Texas when all this happened. Your 16-year-old foster daughter has been molested by both her father and her stepfather, but she's been a model child in your foster home. And one Saturday, while you're house cleaning together, you ask her if she would like a bologna sandwich for lunch. And she flies into a rage and tries to choke you. What do you think happened here? She was 16. She had been in this foster home for several months. She was absolutely a perfect child. And all of this happened. The foster dad's outside doing yard work or something. It was a Saturday. And he heard his wife screaming. And he came in. He finds the kid on top of the foster mom, trying to choke the foster mom. And he pulled her off. And some foster parents would have reached for the phone and put the 30-day notice in. These were enlightened foster parents, and they sat down and said, what just happened here? What do you think happened here?
She was offered a bologna sandwich after they did whatever they did to her.
Somehow bologna must have been involved in her trauma.
Tell me what you just said. I can hear Neva the best.
Probably offered a bologna sandwich after they did whatever they did to her.
Yeah. It was a trigger for sure. The reason I use this is just because they were so perfect, these foster parents. They couldn't get in touch with anybody. It was a Saturday. I think they could find the therapist. The therapist was probably up in the spa someplace and they couldn't find her. And they couldn't find the child care worker. And of course, the on-call people half the time didn't answer their phones. So they had to rely on their own instincts. And they did sit down once she calmed down and said, tell us what just happened here. And that was exactly what you just said. It was exactly what you just said, that after she was molested by the father or the stepfather, they had these little codes. And they would say to her, how would you like a bologna sandwich? And she had never told anybody this. So they didn't know. They didn't know what had happened. A lot of times with the kids that I've worked with, there are code things that happen. And what you find, there was one kid who had a lot of very long hair, and she would not let I think I use it an example later, she would not let the foster parent comb her hair or try to get the knots out of her hair, because every time her dad wanted to molest her, he would start by combing her hair. That was the code that we're going to have sex now because I'm going to comb your hair. So sometimes kids have triggers that make no sense at all, and you don't know what they are until you inadvertently step into one of these traps. So, but what they did was perfect. I mean, of course, he got the kid off his wife before she choked her to death. But then they did what good child care staff do. Everybody calmed down. They waited till she was calm. They got her a glass of water. Everybody sat down. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody yelled. Nobody blamed. And they found out what happened. So when you have that kind of a reaction, and it's handled as beautifully as these people handled it, it's the beginning of treatment, because this kid had not told anybody about this at that point. So, of course, a lot of things that happen in Texas sometimes look pretty similar to the stuff that happens in Florida. Different states are different. When I tell you these stories, sometimes the southern states or places like Texas have some of these stories that really stand out to me. And this story, I believe I told you last week. You have 3 unrelated foster daughters in your home, all between the ages of 13 and 15, and they have all been molested. And one night you go into one of the bedrooms and you find them all engaged in sexual activity with each other. So the 2 13-year-olds immediately start to blame the 15-year-old because she was bigger than they were. And she said that 15-year-old's a lesbian and she made them do it. And the 15-year-old said, oh, no, these younger girls, they're all bisexual. Remember, they were either gay, straight, or bisexual at that point. And that they participated willingly in the activity. Now, I will have to tell you that this is a funk story, and it was handled very, very badly. If you guys don't think that you have come a long way in the last 15 years. You absolutely have, in terms of what you are trained to do and what you do. But do you remember how I told you what happened with this story? This is the story I told you last week. And it was not handled well. It wasn't handled well at all.
Last week, you told us that they immediately reported to DCF.
Yeah, the cops.
And I'm trying to
They made me
remember.
call law enforcement.
Ma'am?
I said they made me call law enforcement. It wasn't even
That was
DCF.
it.
And why was that a bad response?
Well, one, law enforcement can't do anything, so you're automatically giving your power away as the treatment agency. You're giving your power to law enforcement. So the kids are like, oh, everything we do must be bad or criminal, and that's not a good, healthy space.
Right.
But I think it falls into that blame and shame category of if you don't know the story, you don't take time to listen to the story and figure out what is close to figure out what was going on as you could, and then teaching to it or monitoring behavior differently, you're just doing more harm than good.
Absolutely. And
how I feel like we would handle that is we would separate the young women, we would ask them questions to see what the stories were when they were not together, because it sounds like the two 13-year-olds together. We would ask them questions. We would not interview or interrogate, but we would just ask them simple questions like, how did you end up in this space where this was a possibility? And then we would, I know our residential staff would let me know immediately.
Right.
And then I would, of course, say, please also contact Micah and Alexis, and then we would together come up with a game plan based on whatever we knew from previous behaviors. I don't think immediately we would not call law enforcement. Would we do a DCF report? Possibly, probably, but we would not immediately call law enforcement, because the reality is we don't have investigative powers, and if they're going to need to do something, they'll need to do like a what is it called? It's the thing that Tyrese went for. The interview, the forensic interview. That's what it is. They'll need to do that. Yeah. We've had a bunch of them do it, but I think we would be very methodical in our reaction, not freaking out in our reaction, and not for sure being angry or upset about it, at least publicly.
Right, exactly, at least publicly. Freaking
Privately,
out.
we'd be like, what the world?
Freaking out was the reaction of the day. And I think I also told you that those old cottages had 2 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms with a shared bath. So this happened in the bathroom, because every night, I mean, they couldn't leave their bedrooms, but they could get into the bathroom. So they were all 4 of them in the bathroom, or 3 of them, however many I had there. And you're right, law enforcement came, kind of laughed at me, and I was really saying, why are we calling the cops? And they just left. But the only thing I would say about this is that, to be fair to childcare staff from 15 years ago, they had no idea how to deal with this kind of stuff. And they weren't trained in how to deal with this kind of stuff. So if you're trained and you're supported, you know what to do. You guys know what to do. There was not a lot of training in this area. But could we have done a lot of harm to these kids? Absolutely. I mean, the natural tendency was to blame the oldest kid. And what ended up happening, and I think I might have shared some of this with you last week, is that I had to sit down with each one of them and say, you know, what exactly happened here? And I didn't know them very well at the time, because I hadn't been here for very long. I think I'd been here for 3 weeks. But that was kind of the beginning of healing, because they each were individually able to tell me about their own history of molestation. And like I said to you last week, I came into this thinking that all of this had been reported to the department and they'd been treated, and the reason they were here was because they had had this treatment history, and none of the above was true. They had had nothing. So we began the process with most of them, of healing at this point. But that was my most extreme FUMP story. And again, because I'd only been here for 3 weeks, I hadn't gotten FUMPized yet, so I didn't quite understand that crazy stuff seemed to happen on that main campus all the time. All right, we got one more, and then we'll wrap this up and let you guys shake it all out and do whatever it is that you do to shake this stuff out. Your 15-year-old foster son has a history of severe and violent abuse at the hands of his fathers and uncles. He has displayed aggressive sexual behavior towards other children, and now he's in your home as a specialized therapeutic foster child, which means there can only be one child in the home. He is the only child in your home. He has a very specific sexual safety contract. He's in sexual abuse treatment. And they didn't change the wording on this, Neva, but he had an electric gate around his room to monitor his activities at night, which meant if he opened the bedroom door, it would sound in the computer in the foster parent's room. Nobody zapped him, but his behaviors were electronically monitored. I believe this was a neighbor to family foster child because they used that electronic monitoring. And despite all these precautions, you find him on the way to your 3-year-old's room. He has a pencil in his hand, and you find drawings in his room that indicate he was going to sodomize your son. So this is a 3-year-old, this is your 3-year-old, and this is a 15-year-old that you've taken into your home as a specialized therapeutic foster home. Really committed. Specialized therapeutic foster parents are really committed to these kids because they can only do one at a time. They get a fairly stiff daily board rate, and they're part of the child's treatment. They are an integral part of what we are doing. But this was a severely traumatized boy. So if this was your 3-year-old and your 15-year-old foster kid, how do you think you would have reacted, and how do you think he did react?
I think the consensus here is what, and maybe this is not how they handled it, but we definitely are triggered by the fact that it's our own child that is potentially a victim. Because when you say only child in the home, I immediately think, oh, the only child in the home. I don't think, oh, we have other kids, because I would struggle to be a sexualized therapeutic treatment home with my own kid present, because you do not know what risk you're putting your own child at. I think it's a little different for me as a parent. I think that would be a struggle for many parents. I mean, I would like to hope that we, ask the child to give over the pencil. We discussed some things with them. We sent him back to his room. We probably didn't sleep the rest of that night. We probably reached out to the agency and the therapist the next day.
Right.
I would like to think that a rational human would do all those things, because there's some irrational parts of my brain right now going, nope, you need to come get this kid. You need to come get this kid ASAP. But again, realizing that I knew the behaviors, I knew the problems before the child came into my home, I might not have picked this as the type of care home I had with a small child in it.
Yeah, all of the above. The end result for this young man was that he really needed a higher level of care. And you know how the state operates. You can't go to that high level of care immediately. You have to prove need. Now, proving need in this case might have hurt their 3-year-old, but he definitely needed to be in a more specific controlled setting. And after this situation, and they did, they were, of course they were upset. I didn't blame them for being upset. But they also, as Neva said, they recognized that they had made a conscious decision to try to work with this kid. They were very skilled foster parents, and they really believed that they could work with him. That's why they took him. And they really felt that what they had in place was protecting him and them, which is why they had the electronic monitoring system. It's why they had the specific sexual safety plan. He had been working well with them. He had been working well in treatment. But the fact that he could not control that behavior, even though he knew he was going to get caught, He knew he had the electric monitoring, but your brain isn't always processing cognitively in moments like that. But after everybody calmed down, everybody was safe, the 3-year-old never knew any of this happened. We all sat down and said, I think this is not enough. That if he is still in this heightened state of arousal and cannot control his behaviors, this probably is a kid that needs a SIP placement. And that's what eventually happened to him. The end story, I never know. But I'm hoping that a higher level of care would have helped to help this young man. Boys who have been molested, and we have a lot of these stories, at the hands of fathers and uncles and brothers and people that are supposed to be your loving family members, are some of the most confused kids that you're going to work with. So what we just ended up doing is saying, we've learned from this. This isn't enough. The state didn't want to pay for anything other than specialized therapeutic, but it's not enough. So we did end up putting him in a SIP placement. So sometimes, at least out of this sadness comes some good stuff. So all I want you to understand from all of this is that kids act out, they act out their feelings of abuse. They may look okay, but they're not okay. And we certainly know that some of this is a lot more concerning than others. If you have a kid who absolutely cannot cognitively understand that when he opens that door, he's going to get caught, then that means that that kid really needs a higher level of care. There was a young man on the Enterprise campus a couple of years ago who came in, had been fairly severely sexually abused, again, an incest case, got into the back of one of the vans with a girl from one of the other cottages. I think they were driving to school. It was before Legacy School, so they were taking them to public school. And he, in the van, pushed this kid down on the floor and tried to penetrate her. He absolutely was unable to control that behavior. And when you see that level, then you know this isn't enough. A group home with this kind of treatment is just not enough. And we want it to be enough. So sometimes you just have to take these things that happen. Yes, maybe you're going to call the department. Yes, you're going to file an incident report. But what you're going to do is say, what do we do now? Because this is just not enough. So, but it's okay for you to be upset. You just have to know what to do. And when we have to effectively confront kids, and I hear that you do stay calm. When I say this is no time for hysteria, I've seen plenty of hysteria in the original reaction. And you know what? That's okay. Be hysterical with me. Be hysterical with your therapist, and then calm down. Because your job is going to be to go back and to reassure this kid that they aren't bad, that you're going to help them, that you're going to keep them safe. And sometimes that's hard if you're upset yourself. So, as they say, in conclusion, I'm a lot more encouraged than I was when I started, because you guys are certainly along the continuum of being a part of these kids' treatment. And it's good to hear, although Mike has been telling me this for a long time, and she's the one that asked me to do this, but it does sound like you know what you're supposed to do. It doesn't mean that, it's like Neva said, you think, God, this is a horrible thing. This kid is awful. And then you kind of calm down and figure out what to do. And it sounds like that's what you do. It sounds like you have a supportive team. And that's really important. All right, have you had enough? Have I overdosed you completely?
No, I think Alexis is going to once again come in and process with us, so we can chat about how we're all feeling right now. I think the scenarios at the end are always the hardest for us, just because.
Yeah.
Just because.
Yeah, they are. And you know, the thing for me that's sad is that I can see actual people, because they're almost always things that they're from my caseload or from people that I've worked with. So I look at them and I think I can see their faces. I can remember trying to sit and talk with them. And it's really hard what these kids go through, and what foster parents and childcare staff go through in trying to work with them is very difficult. And I can also tell you that the stories from Florida have been so much more extreme than some of the stories that I dealt with I worked in North Carolina, I worked in New York State, I worked in Massachusetts. It's just different cultural differences. And some of them are just extremely difficult. They're extremely difficult, and they're usually intergenerational. They've gone on for a long time, and your job is tough. It's really tough. So for those of you who do not drink, I don't know what to suggest for you as a decompression. For me, it's usually a nice glass of wine at the end of the day, but I can't speak to what you do. So, all right, I'm gonna get off. Anybody else have anything that they want to say before we let Alexis do her thing?
No, ma'am. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week.
All right, thank you, you guys. Take care.